Hey everyone, it's Xinfonia. I usually do two separate videos, but this time I'm combining them both. The first part will be exploring Cipher's kit, then the normal guide stuff, relics, builds, Eidolons, teams, and comparisons like Cipher vs Topaz or Cipher vs Jiaoqiu and so on. Anyways, Cipher has an extremely unique kit and she brings to the team more than just extra damage, mainly because of her ultimate and how it records damage. Cipher records 24% of the damage dealt to a single enemy who is the Patreon. For everyone else, it's 16% damage recorded. However, this does not record overflow damage, so if the enemies are 1 HP and you use like a huge nuke, the Herta's Enhanced or Acheron's Ultimate, barely any of the damage dealt will be recorded. Because of this, Cipher feels very much like a clean-up unit to me, but we'll get to that later. Being 100% true damage of the recorded value, the way you can use this ultimate is very flexible, because it ignores all the pesky things like damage reduction on bosses and so on. Honestly, probably why this Apocalyptic Shadows Kafka has like an additional 50% damage reduction, because Cipher can just ignore all of that and she's incredibly strong to bosses like Flame Reaver for the same reason. On top of the true damage, Cipher applies a 40% vulnerability debuff to all enemies just by existing on the field, which is really powerful for obvious reasons. You don't have to reapply it or whatever, it's almost like a harmony buff. She can also use follow-up attacks every single turn with an additional 100% crit damage, and is able to increase her own attack by 30% every time she uses her skill. This also reduces the enemy's damage by 10%. Oh, and the reason why it's 24% and 16% true damage recorded is because of this really powerful bonus ability that increases Cipher's crit rate and damage recorded based on her speed, which is why 170 speed is super important for Cipher. Follow-ups, debuffs, and re-educating damage. My first thought when seeing such a kit is that she would be very good for units like Facial and Acheron because a lot of the damage is sort of bulky. You can deal a lot of damage whenever they use their ultimate, which naturally makes it less efficient because you can't use this attack as often as others, and that's where Cipher would come in. Perhaps you're missing a bit of damage to go into phase 2, but your ultimate completely overkills, then using Cipher's true damage would easily solve that issue. Which is why, when it comes to relics, I actually think an ERR rope or ERR planer is pretty good. This allows Cipher to get 2 ultimates in 300 action value depending on your team, and means you are able to use her ultimate on both waves. You can scale basic, or you can alternate between skill and basic to play her. The first way obviously saves more skill points because you basic attack more, but you lose the 30% attack buff on the last turn. Also, the timing of when you get the ultimate is a bit weird without any energy regen. It's on the 8th turn, which is quite hard to get in 300 action value. You can try and gamble the energy because she's only 5 energy off, but you're still looking at a 7 turn rotation. And so this is where it gets a bit complicated. With Facial and Robin, with an additional 100% action advance, Cipher is already guaranteed 3 turns in the first 150 AV, but on the second wave, if Cipher doesn't have 200 speed or more, it's still only 3 turns. Hence, if you don't run ERR at all, you cannot get the second ultimate. But with both Robin and 200 speed, Cipher is able to get 4 turns in the second wave, which allows Cipher to run an ERR planer, but an attack rope instead of ERR for maximum damage. Whereas in an Acheron team, if you are not using Robin, you most likely need an ERR rope and pseudo 200 speed, maybe from action advance or whatever, so that Cipher can take 4 turns, 1 from the first wave and 3 from the second. Basically, whether you use an ERR rope or planer completely depends on when you want to use her ultimate and obviously how many turns she is allowed to get. Yes, I guess you can hold all her true damage for big PP damage, which would mean you don't need ERR at all, but I think that defeats a large purpose of Cipher's kit and I don't think that's how she should be played, other than some very specific cases. Thankfully, running an ERR rope actually doesn't lose you that much damage anyways, because Cipher's multipliers are just really low in general. Most of the damage comes from the true damage. Like in Acheron's team, Cipher's individual damage is only about 3% of the total, while in the Facial team it's about 9% because of Robin. So when she loses the 43% attack, it's a pretty small difference. Like for Facial, it was only about 2% worse overall. For the rest of your relics, crit damage body is pretty obvious because she gets 50% crit rate if you have 170 speed, which would obviously mean speed boots. For her sphere, I found the damage orb to be better for both Acheron and Facial teams, though the difference is pretty small, so I guess run whichever has better substats. For Relic Sets, Pioneer Lusaka actually performed the best for me, followed by Pioneer Glamoth for both Acheron and Facial. Windsoaring is quite bad and performs worse than even Genius with just the 24% defense reduction with S1. I've also been thinking about how Cipher would use Eagle, but in both Acheron and Facial teams, Cipher is already able to hit the energy requirement. So I guess this could be for cases where you're not using Dance or Robin or you can't hit 200 speed. I can't really think of other scenarios where Eagle would perform well. Once again, probably because her multipliers are just low in general, the 12% attack for Facial or Acheron from Lusaka is better than the 12% attack and 18% damage boost from Glamoth for Cipher. Cipher obviously loses damage, but Facial and Acheron make much better use of the 12% attack, which leads to higher damage overall. For the other 2-piece sets, Duran can be used for follow-up teams like Facial, and Izumo is obviously for at least double Nihility teams, which right now would be Acheron or Kafka. Sprightly is kinda similar to Eagle, I can't really find a good scenario for it. Enid should work as a decent general use ornament, and Fleet of the Aegis is just me cooking. I unironically think it can be decent in Caster's teams because of the extra HP, and she even gives all allies extra attack percentage, which includes herself. For light cones, right now there are really only two good light cones, her S1 and Pearls. S1 gives a ton of speed, which is what I was yapping about earlier. It is possible to get 200 speed with her S1, one of the few characters able to do so. If I didn't already make it clear before, 200 speed gives you 3 turns in 150 action value. This is very rarely talked about because very little characters are ever able to cross 200 speed. It also gives defense reduction, which is super convenient because it applies on every enemy even if you only hit one of them, and this counts as stacks for Acheron even if you are reapplying it. Whereas for Pearls, there are some weird cases if the debuff hasn't run out. It doesn't count as stacks for Acheron. I have no clue why this is the case or if this is intentional or not, but this does mean there are stacks for Acheron. You obviously lose the speed too, going from S1 to Pearls, but it doesn't matter that much for Facial. It's about a 10% increase or 3k DPAV, whereas for Acheron it matters a lot more, a 22% increase and about 7k DPAV. The rest of the light cones are kinda meh, so let's hope there are better Nihility light cones coming soon. Anyways, for stat goals, always obviously 170 speed, you lose way too much for not hitting this breakpoint. The rest are kinda guidelines, again the 200 speed for 3 turns, 39% effective rate for S1 or E2, and 67% for Pearls. I found my Cipher builds to have about high 1000s to low 2000 attack and about 180 to 200% crit damage in battle. Her trait's priority is quite straightforward. Her basic abilities just increase her damage multipliers, which is pretty low even at max level, so I wouldn't recommend maxing them, but the bonus abilities are very important. And now for Cipher teams and comparisons. For my simulations this time, I used Sustainers, which is really rare because I like to aim my simulations at more casual players, but due to some constraints, especially when using Robin, I wanted more consistency, so I used Robin plus RMC for example. I also extended the simulation for Facial to get a better feel for Cipher because like I said, she can get just about 2 outs in the first 2 0 cycles or 300 action value. So you can't compare any of this to my previous calculations because the context of the simulation is just very different. We can only roughly gauge the difference. Can I just say it's really hard to calculate Cipher's impact on the team, especially when I usually use raw damage like DPAV due to how her kit works. Hence, for whatever calculation I'm going to show you, you can estimate the increase to be moderately higher in reality. Unless you are running sustain, then it might decrease a little bit. Firstly, for Cipher versus Topaz in the Facial team, both with S1, I found Cipher to be about 30% better, or roughly a 6000 DPEV increase, which is relatively big. I think a large contributing factor is because Cipher's vulnerability applies to everything, while for Topaz, the 50% only applies to follow-ups. And when you have a unit like Robin in your team, who can deal a lot of damage, the extra vulnerability increases the damage quite significantly, which means even more true damage for Cipher. Funnily enough, even for attacks like Facial's ultimate, Facial still did more damage with Cipher, which means in terms of damage, Cipher's team completely outclasses Topaz. Even in terms of individual contribution, Cipher is only about 100,000 damage behind Topaz, and when you factor in her true damage, Cipher deals more than twice of what Topaz does. Again, this doesn't even take into consideration how much easier it is to play Cipher, because you can easily move the Patreon debuff around and her true damage is even spread out across 3 targets, so you don't have to force Facial to hit the enemy with Proof of Depth, which can be quite awkward and doesn't show in calculations. For Acheron at E0, it's pretty much just going to be Cipher versus Pela with no 5-star light cone, but obviously it's a bigger increase compared to Topaz. I found it to be almost a 50% increase in damage or 10k DPAV, which is a huge upgrade. Not only does she provide more stacks for Acheron, she deals more damage, her debuffs are permanent and not tied to her ultimate, and she can still reallocate damage on top of that. It's really not even close. For Jiaoqiu versus Cipher, which is probably more of an issue at E2 Acheron, it's honestly been quite hard for me to figure out as well. Basically, it comes down to the content and your investment level, which is why it's really hard to calculate. Because Jiaoqiu obviously gives you more debuffs, right? Which means Acheron can use more ultimates, but the issue is, I would sometimes find that Acheron can use 3 ultimates in 150 action value, which would normally be a good thing, but the enemies are already super low after the second, which means the third ultimate, even though it should deal more raw damage than with a Cipher team, most of it is wasted damage. And it feels super bad because you have to waste an ultimate just to clear the wave within the cycle. Whereas for Cipher, it would be harder to get 3 ultimates, but I can actually save Crimson Knots for the second phase of the fight because I can just use Cipher's ultimate to clean up and remove a lot of the clunkiness from Acheron's gameplay. And if you are even more invested, like I don't know, maybe E1 3B or something, then you only need 2 ultimates, which means Jiaoqiu won't even be able to give you the extra debuffs because the cycle ends too early, which again favors Cipher. Hence, even though Jiaoqiu should technically give more raw damage for Acheron, I think gameplay wise, Cipher is actually just better when it comes to clearing content as fast as possible, but you most definitely need to be quite invested. Like if your relics are garbage, then Jiaoqiu might appear to be better, because 3 ultimates now fit better than a well-invested Acheron. I mean, in general, Cipher will do better the more invested your team is, because she records your damage, right? So the more damage you do, the better Cipher will perform. Although for pure fiction, Jiaoqiu is most likely still better, because that game mode cares a lot more about how fast you can attack, which is what Jiaoqiu is great at. Hence, for Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow, I think Cipher is actually a big upgrade for both Acheron and Facial. I genuinely think it is worth pulling Cipher if you main these 2 teams or you use them frequently. The added bonus to getting Cipher would be that she is also really good in pretty much every other team. Her debuffs are vulnerability and defense reduction, which means she can buff every single team in the game. She's probably even more versatile than Runmei because she has damage boost and has a kit kind of like Tribi. She most likely will not be the best in slot in other teams that is not Acheron or Facial, but will probably be a close second or third depending on how well you are at using Cipher's kit. Obviously, I don't know if future damage dealers will have Cipher as their best in slot, but if there are intentionally clunky DPS units in the future, there is a very good chance Cipher will be pretty good there. And now finally, Cipher's vertical investment. Cipher's E1 now records damage at 150% of the original value, and she gains an 80% attack buff permanently because she uses her follow-up every turn. This is obviously very strong because the strongest part of her kit, the true damage, is buffed, and she even gets a little boost to her own damage. E2 is an extra 30% vulnerability, but this seems to only apply to the enemy she hits, unlike S1, so it performs better for single target teams like Facial, and slightly worse for teams like Acheron. E4 is an additional 50% damage when the Patreon is attacked, so kind of like a worse version of Robin's ultimate, and is the lowest increase in damage for her Eidolons. Finally, E6 increases the damage dealt of a follow-up attack by 350%. This is not an independent multiplier, but she does record an additional 16% damage dealt by specifically her follow-up attack, and instead of resetting her charges, she retains 20% of the damage recorded. Obviously a very strong Eidolon, and even without accounting for the leftover true damage, it is already a significant boost. For E1 versus S1, it depends on the team. E1 S0 performs better for Facial, she doesn't really need the debuff application, or E0 S1 performs better for Acheron. If you have both, I guess you can consider E1 S1, that's also fine. I just would never touch E3 or E4. That is all I have for Cipher. Good luck pulling, don't forget to like or subscribe if it helped you, and see you.